You may need any material. There. And the birdettes, Ricky, is the only other I saw. We'll have to start recruiting some more teachers for our younger classes. Ask a little simple Bible question here the other day. It was supposed to be about Abraham and what happened to his son. I asked simply, what happened there? He said, he shot him. Tammy Lehman's teaching that class. So not only do we find a weapon that probably was not in use at that time, but instead of an animal being caught in a thicket and shooting it, instead, nope, Abraham shot poor old Isaac. I guess he just wounded him maybe. But I'm not going to tell you whose kid that was. But he does have some kinfolk in Oklahoma. It could very well be that the teaching he received at home overrode the correct teaching he learned in class and couldn't overcome that false doctrine he was being told at home, or she was being told at home. One or the other. I'm not going to tell you which one. All right, we're studying in this chapter concerning a malady of the heart, and of course, one that we should seek to remove from its very existence in our lives, and it is none other than hatred. We laid the whole big old tall foundation from just a few passages of Scripture which were provided in this lesson as to how that this matter of having a correct attitude towards friend and foe alike is not something that came along lately, but it goes all the way back to the very beginning, and that God has always held mankind accountable for the attitude that he possesses, and we've always, and most people will take the position that God holds mankind responsible for the actions, but not only that, but all the way back into the patriarchal age, and of course through the Mosaic age, and certainly the Christian age, it's the attitude behind the deed that also must meet with God's approval. And a person could on the outside be doing everything just fine dandy, but his heart be rotten and end up being lost. And so that oftentimes desire upon some people's part to try to make a distinction between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, of course, is false and is easily demonstrated, as we already have done in regards to this particular topic in this study here. We are to hate sin, but at the same time, we are to love those who participate in sin. And of course, it might well indeed be a play on words or whatever. But of course, if it were not for individuals who promoted, say, the gay lifestyle, then we wouldn't have such a problem in trying to get people to see the problem with the gay lifestyle. That which the Bible describes as an abomination and people promote as being fine and dandy. If people weren't doing that, then there wouldn't be anything to argue about, see? So it's those who are the promoters of and the pushers of those things that we don't hate, but we certainly dislike and wish they did not get their way so often, sadly. And I read just this past week how that you could give yourself a little bit of a test based upon what Jesus taught in the 25th chapter of the book of Matthew as it relates to this understanding in maybe a little bit better way the difference between what the Bible says hate is and maybe the definition that we would ascribe to it. Even if your enemy, somebody that you absolutely did not want to accomplish anything because of their dastardly deeds, their position, whatever, their philosophy, their intentions, then if that individual was to need a couple of pints of the type of blood that you have, and if you didn't give it to them, there's nobody there to give it to them, they would die. If you gave your blood, that'd be a pretty good indication you don't really hate that person like Cain hated his brother Abel and killed him, you see. Or if you saw him in need of food, and if you didn't supply him with a can of Spam or something, he's going to starve to death. And you gave what you could to help him, well, that'd be a pretty good indication you don't hate him. You dislike him, dislike the stuff that he does, wouldn't dare invite him to go on a cruise with you around the world, but you don't hate him in the sense that you wish them dead, and the only thing that's keeping you from killing them is because you don't want to go to jail, or you're a coward, or the consequences would be too terrible. So, and of course, same thing with a person is thirsting to death, and you have the ability to remove his thirst, and you're the only one that can, and you did, well, that'd be a pretty good indication there that you're, in actuality, loving your enemy like you're supposed to. You're not hating them. And while you detest the stuff they stand for, detest sometimes the things they say, you know, and if they were walking along the side of the road, and if you said, here's my opportunity, you run over there and you run over them and kill them, then I'd say you probably hate them, you know. But if you actually say, do you need some help with your car, you know, do you need a ride to the filling station on up the road or whatever, then that'd be a pretty good indication you don't hate them. And so maybe our word, when we say we hate something sometimes, it's not the detesting type of hate that will result in the murder of the object of that hate, as is the case from these examples in the Bible. But God hates sin, no doubt about it. And God does not aid and abet those who are guilty of promoting sin, and neither can we. I know a few years ago, there were a lot more than presently I've been confronted with Jehovah's Witnesses that were out beating doors on, a weekly basis. Every week at least, there'd be at least one couple that would knock on my door, you know. Well, there were some that members of the church that I heard discussing the matter, and they said, I would not dare let them in my house because John says, if any man bids him Godspeed, he's a partaker of his evil deeds. You don't invite him into your house. You don't. Well, is that really what John is talking about in 2 John verses 9 through 11? You know? No, he's not really. He's saying, do not aid and abet, extend fellowship to, so as to assist someone that's teaching error. Now, I know I always took the position that as long as they're at my house and I'm studying with them, then they're not teaching somebody else that don't know any better, and they might believe what they say to be true, you see. So I'm keeping them, as long as I've got them in my house trying to study with them, I'm keeping them from being able to do their harm to somebody else who maybe doesn't have a clue as to the area that they're being fed, see. So to take that position, while this was a soothing conscience matter for the particular lady I heard say it, you know, that's a misrepresentation of that passage of Scripture, for sure. And, of course, too, you could use it as an excuse for not knowing better error that is taught by our religious neighbors, because if you are going to let somebody come into your house, and if you are really going to study with them, then you better know the truth, or else you're liable to be one of their converts, you know. And sadly, so many times people are so unfamiliar with the truth that when error is taught, they don't see it as error. So we have to be forearmed and forewarned and knowledgeable of the truth so that we actually can then do our best to convert someone. Now, does that happen very often? Few and far between times does that happen, you know. I've not ever had any long, lengthy, week after week, month after month studies with any Jehovah's Witnesses, because they pretty well set their foot down close to the very beginning that they were not about to read anything you gave them. They wouldn't even touch it, you know. I had a lady one time at Hill Circle, I thought she just about fell off the porch. I was trying to just hand her a little old tract about the virgin birth of Christ, you know. And she put up her arms behind me, you know, and she did scraped on one of the poles there, or else she'd have gone off the porch, you know, trying to get away from. Didn't even want to touch such error that I was promoting. But she wanted me to read her garbage, you know, which is not very consistent, obviously, somewhat hypocritical. But I studied for 2 years with, ended up being 3 different sets of Mormon elders, when we was living in Smith County. And honestly, I got more information from them to understand their position better than I would have ever got just by reading, because of this monthly Bible study that we had. But about the time, you might figure that about the time that I'd think that I was really making some headway, then whoops, here's 2 new guys that come in next month, and those 2 have gone somewhere else, and but they're very conservative, but one of the big things about them is they'll take a Bible principle and then they'll make a big fanfare about it, as if here's something that we are doing that needs to be addressed. And it may be something so outlandish as the need to spend more time in developing good families. Did that start with Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon? Well, of course not. So here they make a big play about the need to protect our families, which the Bible is taught from the get-go. But yet they spin it in such a way that here's this new way of looking at it through the enlightened eyes of the prophet Joseph Smith, who knew just exactly how to destroy families and to have a whole bunch of women and call them wives, and then have umpteen offspring too in an adulterous arrangement, and do it all with supposedly God's approval as a latter-day prophet. Ridiculous. So to understand that, you have to be able to. But even those people that you invite into your house, does that mean, according to one sister, you can't give them a drink of water after you've been studying for 2 hours? Well, as long as they keep their goozle wet, the more they're going to be there studying. And so there's an opportunity. But then when they start to leave, you don't say, are y'all about out of gas? Here, let me give you $20 to put in your car. No, that's aiding and abetting that which is wrong, Or the next time you're here, come in, I'll put you up for supper and I'll feed you and we might go play golf the next day. No, that's aiding and abetting that which is false. That's extending fellowship and assisting in that which is condemned. And we can't do that with the denominational world. We can't do that with brethren who are off, either to the left or to the right, without doing damage to the very principle there that John lays out. Because remember, the reason why he wrote that is that here was an elect lady who I believe was a genuine woman who was a Christian. And during that time in which they didn't have a Holiday Inn on every street corner, while they did have inns, they didn't have near the amount that we have today. And so brethren depended upon other brethren to put them up overnight as they were traveling, which is a wonderful thing. Still exists in some localities. People do that, We had a fellow held a meeting for us here a few years ago, and he absolutely refused to stay in a motel. He insisted on staying in my house. He did like my bread. That might be one of the reasons why. But he said, I don't want to stay in a motel. He said, that's a waste of the Lord's money. And besides, I want to be able to talk to you. I want to be able to. I said, well, I got a phone. No, we had a really, really good time together. But times have changed to the point where now people have, even our brethren, have so much stuff going on that, and I know this for a fact, that you look at a gospel meeting somewhere, you look at that as an opportunity to write a couple of chapters for upcoming lectureship books, And because you're having to squeeze all the time you can in little pockets of time. And so that's the only time they get away from the wife and the kids and get away from the brethren, so they can actually write a chapter or 2 for upcoming lectureships or whatever, which, takes away from the wonderful fellowship that used to exist when a gospel meeting would begin in Dunlap, Tennessee, and the visiting preacher would walk up and down the streets of Dunlap, inviting people as he went along to come to the meeting, and those days are just about gone. But the church grew by leaps and bounds during that period of time when there was more camaraderie observable among brethren by the outside world and was enjoyed more so because there was more of it by brethren within the body of Christ too. And that's why, sometimes when people say those were the good old days, that was a good old day example for sure. Not carrying water up a hill, that ain't a good old day. That's hard, or walking to school is uphill both ways, 10 miles or whatever. But there were good things that was associated with that back during the previous generations for sure.
Seems like to me the main thing there is somebody's teaching false doctrine, that's their goal, that's what they're all about. You don't provide them resources or extend to them any encouragement
Exactly.
to allow them to continue on. But can you have a discussion with them about the gospel?
Absolutely.
You need to.
Absolutely. You don't encourage them. And of course, there's hundreds of different ways you can encourage them, and you just can't do that. You just can't do it. Whatever. And of course, if there's something that's questionable, and this might be looked upon as being a possible aiding and abetting of it, and encouragement, then don't do it, if it appears that way. Now, if somebody happens to drive by and they have taken the position about 2 John 9-11 that you don't allow a false teacher in your house, and they see two bicycles sitting there in the front of the house, and later on they see two boys riding those bicycles with white shirts on, ties, and got a little old clip on there identifying them as Elder Jones and Elder Smith, they say, Freddie was extending fellowship to them. Well, we can't help it if people don't know what the Bible teaches, You can't go around and educate brethren to the point they don't draw dumb conclusions. If you are given the opportunity, you clear up that matter for sure. And not let people hide behind the false concept, I can't have anything to do with this person because they don't teach the truth. No, what did Aquila and Priscilla do with a fellow that they noticed was preaching error? Right? Took him aside and taught him the way of the Lord more perfectly. And if it hadn't been for was that a demonstration of love or hate? Well, obviously that's love. There's love for Apollos and love for the truth, every way around, love for the gospel system. And they demonstrated that by actively involving themselves in teaching him better. And a wonderful attitude that was on public display very quickly with Apollos is he didn't step back and say, well, don't you know how eloquent of a preacher am I? He didn't do that. Just like in Acts chapter 8, you don't see where here's a government official who's in charge of the treasurer of Queen Candace, and here's a preacher that has the audacity to say, do you understand what you're reading? What do you mean I don't understand? Don't you know who I am? He didn't have that attitude at all, And so there was a fellow I would classify as being one of the mighty, noble, upper crust in society that is mentioned at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 1 when Paul says, not many like that are called by the gospel. In other words, not many have the open and receptive heart to realize, hey, I need the truth, which means I have to humble myself and recognize that I'm a sinner in need of a Savior. Not many people in a position like the Ethiopian eunuch would do that, but some do, because he did. And he knew when to go on his way rejoicing too, didn't he? It was after he'd obeyed the gospel.
Randy, I had an experience several years ago when somebody did people going door to door. This guy came to the door, rang the doorbell, and I went to the door and he introduced himself. I said, come on in. And he said, before he said that, he said, you remember Church of Christ, aren't you? I said, yes. I said, why? That makes something like that. He said, well, most people won't shut the door in my face. He said, but remember the Church of Christ, they invite you in. I said, they're trying to convert you.
Exactly.
And he promised me he'd come down to the Dallas, so I figured in that class. He promised me he'd come down there one Wednesday night and sit in my class, and I agreed to go down and sit in the other. He never showed up.
He never showed up, yeah. And that's the thing is, if you know what the truth is, you should never be fearful of error exposing it. You just want to do it. I mean, I've told you when I was fixing to have a debate found out later on that he was a missionary Baptist preacher that was more than twice as old as me, and it had like 35 or 40 debates. And Brother Woods was going to be my moderator, which, other than the Lord or the Apostle Paul, I was sitting pretty, Well, lo and behold, he ended up being found that he had a kidney that had been dead for years and had to have it took out. And so he didn't get to do it. And I found this out about 2 months before the debate. And he said, Freddie, he said, don't worry about it. He said, let me tell you something. He said, one of the first times I ever had a debate, I had it with a missionary Baptist preacher. And I was sort of anxious about it, And I thought, Brother Woods anxious about debating, He said, yeah, I knew this fellow was experienced, and here I was, just a young man. And he was probably about the same age I was. And he said, and it finally dawned on me one night. He said, listen, if this man was very smart, he wouldn't be a missionary Baptist. And I thought, well, that's right. If this guy was highly intelligent, he wouldn't be promoting false doctrine. And ever since he said that, just think about it. Now, people have a way with words and communicating abilities that will sway people to believe what they say, even if it's diametrically opposed to what the Bible teaches. But they're going to do that with anything anyhow, If you got the truth and you know the truth, you should never be fearful of somebody who holds to error, It's like a person, like we saw when we viewed the debate here where Kyle Butt was debating this college professor, who'd written all these books, Well, I tell you, Kyle made him look like a complete idiot because he couldn't answer just plain, old, simple, cold, hard facts. He couldn't do it, And all he could do is make fun of Kyle's name or change the discussion to something else, but he couldn't answer the truth. The truth has nothing to fear from honest investigation. Never has. Now, that don't mean that we're always going to do right by the truth. We can't just say, oh, I obey the truth, therefore I know I can defend it. It's not that easy, But we should not ever be fearful that somebody's going to take a false position and expose us in teaching the truth. That just simply cannot happen unless we fail in our defense of the truth. And sometimes you'll hear people say this, the truth don't need defending, it'll defend itself. And those are people, of course, most of the time that are opposed to debates, Well, think about this. The gospel don't need preaching, it'll preach itself. No, it won't do it by itself, will it? That's just, I don't know, a dodge from responsibility is what it amounts to. But the gospel, God's will, is addressed to the mind of man. And the mind of man can be swayed by logical, sound argumentation. We understand that in every area of education there is, It's not because we dislike some rule of mathematics that we fail the class. It's because we don't accept the truth of the rule of mathematics. That's why, Whether we like it or not, it teaches the same thing. And even so, God's Word. All right, next little section here, the nature of hate. Here are some individual characteristics that are in perfect harmony with this hate. Hate is a characteristic of the unregenerate state. Now, that's a fancy way of saying what? What's the unregenerate state? All right, a person that's lost still, Lost people who don't enjoy the forgiveness of their sins through the blood of Jesus Christ, then it shouldn't really surprise us that they have this heart problem all the time. Hate. Because if you look around the world, that's the way the world is. That's the way the world conducts itself. Hating and killing and all types of ungodly behavior is the way the world works. So, if the world acts like that, it shouldn't surprise us. But when people claim to be Christians and they act like that, then that's a pretty good indication that somebody needs converted, for sure. Number 2, hatred is among the works of the flesh. Of course, Galatians chapter 5, verse 19 through 21. More than half, like 2/3 of the works of the flesh listed here by Paul have to deal with interaction with brethren and with non-brethren. Not with overt acts of and violating sins, like, although there are some there, like don't commit adultery, don't be a drunkard, all that. But the vast majority of them have to do with how human beings get along with each other or fail to get along with each other. If there's constant bickering and biting and divisiveness and warmongering, that others too, it's condemned, but warmongering and all, that right there will cause more people to be lost than people really give it credit being able to have that much power to be able to do that. I mean, when Paul says those that are guilty of these things shall not inherit the kingdom of heaven, then that's about as plain as can be said, that a person who persists in this lifestyle and is guilty of these types of sins, then they can't be saved eternally. Simple as that. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. You know, I was talking to this guy just last week about once saved, always saved. And of course we started out talking about social drinking. And then I remembered reading a debate where this guy was promoting social drinking, but he was not just defending or trying to defend social drinking, he was trying to defend the intake of beverage alcohol up to and including drunkenness. Because his position was, your fleshly man can't do good anyhow, so don't worry about that, just keep your spirit pure. Which is, of course, is the reason why John wrote 1 John, to show that you can't divide between the flesh and the spirit like that. A person that sins, they sin with their flesh and their spirit, you know. Not with one or the other. It said, oh, that was just my body doing that. Didn't have anything to do. No. I mean, Jesus had to teach, you know, that what comes out of your mouth first starts in your heart. So you can't make that false division there. Is the reason why Paul wrote dealing with the Gnostics in 1 John, for sure. But the guy was debating, and he took the position that all the sins that a Christian could commit would not in any way, shape, or form damn his soul, including drunkenness, you know. And I'm not sure, I think it was, I'm not sure. But anyhow, he said, well, if that's the case then, when Paul says that no drunkard shall enter the kingdom of heaven, then that means that here are individuals who are drunks and stay drunks that will never die. They'll just have to keep on living forever. Because you said they can be a drunk and go to heaven. And here's a passage that says there is no such thing as a drunkard that will stay a drunkard and be in heaven. Then here's a person who's going to live forever. Or else you've got a contradiction somewhere, you know. Of course, he didn't have any way to answer that, which is, of course, absolutely ludicrous. And it's not to say that people have had problems with and continue to have problems with beverage alcohol or hundreds of other things. They can overcome it with the Lord's help, and as their determination is to keep on doing better, they can. And we don't put them on a trial period, you know, like we mentioned, John mentioned that one time, about here's a fellow who had to show himself sober for 6 months before he would be allowed to do something, you know. Well, where'd that 6 months come from, you know? I mean, if 6 is justified, why not 3? When we get real strict, make it 1, you know. Number next, hatred is harbored only by fools. Now, what is a fool, as is the term that's used here? What is a fool?
One who says there is no God.
We got a whole big old long list. If you've been reading articles in the Tribune to Shopper, the Bible's identification of fools. So here's a person that flies in the face of the evidence. That's a fool. You know, that's a person that does not use the natural intellectual abilities that all accountable human beings have. He's a foolish person. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, I just heard that on the way over here to the building. Yeah, if you got India and Pakistan that are shooting down each other's jets, then that's going to cause turmoil for sure. And that evidently happened today. So there's some hatred in people that we think are the same thing, you know. I mean, we look at them as living in a part of the world where everybody's just exactly the same. They all think the same thing. Well, what are they doing shooting down each other's jets then? Well, obviously, there's some differences there. And of course, I don't know all the wherewithals of the distinctions there, but there is absolute hatred that does exist there.
I think, well, petition of Pakistan Indians is primarily, but largely a religious thing.
Yeah,
Pakistani being Muslim and Indians being Hindu.
yeah, yeah. Wouldn't be a bit surprised if Hindus and Muslims don't get along. Muslims, true blue Muslims that can't get along with anybody because their responsibility is to convert or kill. Now that's just what their holy book says, so-called. That is strictly taking the words of Allah through Muhammad in a literal way.
It will all be prayed that situation be tapped down.
Oh, it definitely could.
Got sideways.
It could definitely mess up a lot of stuff for a lot of people, including us, in the very near future.
India has the third largest standing army in the world.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But both of them nuclear.
And both of them have nuclear capability, sure. All right, number 4, hatred is cruel. Cruel. And of course, you don't have to go past the very first murder to see the motivation behind it. Here was a fella who was given the opportunity to do better. He was even made aware of how he could do better. He could follow the example of his brother, hear what God said, and worship God accordingly. But instead, he allowed his envy and jealousy to grow to the point of hatred of his brother, and he killed him. And then had the audacity when the Lord said, "Where's your brother?" He said, "Wait a minute. Am I my brother's keeper?" "Well, yeah, you are, you know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And that so-called excuse obviously did not remove responsibility off the shoulders of dear old Cain, for sure. And of course, a lot of the motivation behind the way Joseph's brothers treated him, they hated him. They hated him. And one clear sign, you say, well, you can't say they hated him, you know. Well, you can, because they more than disliked him when they had the opportunity to get rid of him for good, they did. That's a pretty good indication they hated him, you know. And while, of course, Reuben wanted to save him and come back and let him out, evidently, later on, then he ends up going along with their desires anyhow. Number 5, hatred is an evidence of immaturity. Now, what kind of immaturity is this here? Is this physical immaturity? I don't think it's that, is it? It has to be spiritual or emotional or social or all those other immaturities that you can have, you know. Most of the time, I made this observation one time, most of the time when a man and a woman, husband and wife, when they have difficulties in their marriage because of immaturity, it's not because of anything physical immaturity. It's not that. It's emotional, social, and spiritual more than anything else immaturity that causes the problems. And that, along with the other ages that we talk about from time to time, you know, a person's spiritual age is not determined by how many calendar years have passed since they were born. It doesn't have anything to do with it, you know. And so just because you can eat off a senior citizen's menu at Shoney's don't mean that you are spiritually mature. All it means is you've had a bunch of birthdays. And I don't even know if is there still Shoney's down there at, I don't know, Harv.
Of course, hatred doesn't, to hate somebody don't mean we have to physically harm them or murder them. We can hate somebody and do a lot to them in other ways.
Yeah,
That exhibit that hatred,
exactly.
that's not right.
That's just the zenith stuff. When John writes there in 1 John chapter 3, you know, that a person that hates his brother is a murderer. That's the ultimate, I guess, you could say, in that the attitude that resulted in the death of Cain, or the death of Abel, is the attitude that a person possesses if he hates his brother, you know. Now, if it doesn't rise to that level, and it can rise to that level without it actually boiling over into out and out murder, in trying to do untold amounts of harm that should not be even consideration.
Well, that's just like slander and things like that are just as harmful, just to be honest, not, I mean, they can be very harmful.
Yes.
Put it that way.
Than the truth.
That's right.
Yes, yes. Even, and can be more so, you know. Making up stuff is accepted even though it's made up by how a large percentage of people, even though the evidence is there showing it ain't the case later on, you know. Well, if they say to you, where there's smoke, there's fire, you know. If there's an accusation, that means there had to be something there. Well, that's just not right, you know. And I dare say that if we was to abide by the golden rule, we wouldn't want somebody doing that to us, would we? You know, drawing a conclusion, say, oh, where there's smoke, there's fire. If there was an accusation, it had to be something to it. You know, I had to, I mean, do you realize somebody says something about a person and they don't use but the first name of that person? Did you hear about Freddie? Did you hear what Freddie did? Now, there's not a whole slew of Freddies, but there's more than one. So if somebody makes a statement and it's an accurate statement about what Freddie did, but it's not the one that you're trying to get in trouble, you know, then that's not a nice thing to do, you know. And I've actually had to answer questions before. Let me ask you about this because I heard this. Now, boy, talk about scary. And at least they had the gumption to ask, you know, instead of getting on the phone and saying, you know what I heard about that, Freddie? And of course, one of the things I was wanting to mention about hate is one of the reasons why we can have a misunderstanding about hate is because we also have a misunderstanding as to what the Bible says about love, you know. Love bears all things, okay? That means it tolerates anything and everything that's done to it. No, it don't. It thinks the best, but it does not allow itself to be a ball to be kicked down the road spitefully in order to make the one that's doing it feel better about himself. That's not what love is. Love, here's how it's invaded our thinking in our homes. Love would never tell a child no, when in reality, hate would never tell a child no. It's very opposite what the Bible teaches. If a child wants to ride his bicycle down the middle of the highway, then he ought to be allowed to. Well, we know better than that. And that's not love if you try to frame it in a loving thing to do, you know. But yet, and of course you can see then how that would bleed over into the mentality of how we deal with brethren or false doctrine or anything else that demands genuine love manifested in doing and saying, and not just talking about it. Oh, I love it.
I think sometimes we fall short of going from hate to love, we just kind of get stuck in the middle and we're indifferent.
Yeah.
And I think there's a danger in that. You just get to, you don't hate them, but you don't love them enough to go correct them, talk to them. You just kind of get hung out in the middle and indifferent, you don't care.
And that indifferent position there is a whole lot easier. The consequences are terrible, but it's a whole lot easier just not to do anything than to do what you know you need to do. And honestly, if you don't know what you ought to do, then don't just do something to say I'm doing something, you know. But to fail to do anything when you know there's something that needs to be done, you need to get to figuring out what it is that needs to be done for the best of all involved in that situation, whatever it might be. Well, I don't know if the bell has been fixed or not, but I don't want to get run over again. So Lord willing, we'll start right here on page 79 with other evils that is that right? Or did I turn 2 pages? No, I didn't. With the other things that come as outgrowth out of hate. Thank you so much.
Batteries in that bell thing?
See, I thought it was. I thought it was because the breaker had thrown.
Nobody's looking at it. Nobody does it one.
Yeah. No, it's working.
Just nobody back there to bring it.
Roger went around the room.
Did it?
It kinda runs.
Yeah.
I think the battery.
Saying 9 volts up here.
I think 3. Thank you, Rick. Those not break? No, 6 feet. Thank you.
Gabe said, Mom is in neurotrauma ICU.
Oh, okay.
Slow to wake up, but good. 2